Hey guys, tonight we begin not just with a simple story but with a long journey into the remarkable lives and the almost unbelievable resilience of medieval peasants. Those nameless everyday heroes who, against every cruel blow of nature and history, somehow managed to survive nights so cold, so endless, so brutal that many of us today would shiver simply imagining them. Their world was not a tale of knights in shining armour or of golden feasts in candlelit halls, but a tale of grit, of stubborn ingenuity, of families pressed close together under leaking thatched roofs, whispering prayers while the wind outside screamed like an endless choir of wolves. Before you let yourself get too comfortable, before you settle into your modern bed with its soft blankets and steady central heating, take a breath and remember that what we are about to wander into is a world where comfort was never promised, where every sunrise was an uncertain miracle. Now dim the lights, perhaps let the soft hum of a fan or the faint buzz of the night settle around you, and step with me into this story. When you think of medieval life, perhaps you imagine jousting tournaments or strolling minstrels, brightly coloured fairs and the laughter of villagers gathered for harvest. But for the average peasant, for the farmer whose hands were cracked from toil, and whose breath came in frosty puffs under a sky heavy with snow, winter was not a season of merriment. It was not a holiday. It was an exam, a cruel test of endurance that returned year after year, a teacher who never showed mercy and never gave second chances. Imagine living inside a hut of mud and sticks, walls so thin that a sparrow sneezing outside them might echo in your ear, a space with no insulation, no glass window, perhaps only a ragged patch of animal hide stuffed into a hole to keep out the gale. The inside temperature of your home was not warm, it was only politely a few degrees less cold than the outside. If the world beyond your door froze, you merely endured a slightly less punishing freeze within. Nights were the worst of all when darkness swallowed every familiar shape, when the wind clawed at the roof with ghostly fingers, when the fire in the hearth struggled with tiny sparks, licking only the toes of those who sat closest, leaving the others to huddle in shadow, as though camped beneath a pitiless sky. Clothing was no salvation. The medieval peasant did not own fur coats lined with silver fox, nor down-filled blankets plucked from geese. Instead, he had a handful of rough wool tunics, stiff cloaks that smelled of goat and smoke, perhaps patched sheepskin if fortune had smiled, and the hope that by layering them he might become an awkward human onion, trapped inside layers of itchy fabric. Spoiler, the layering seldom worked. Beds were another disappointment, little more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, rushes thrown down half-rotting and alive with fleas. Sometimes the straw was renewed, more often it flattened, moulded, and became an ecosystem of tiny unwanted guests. So each night was not about resting in comfort, but about clinging to life, about gritting your teeth, piling on every cloth you owned, huddling close to your livestock and whispering a prayer that you might awaken in the morning with your eyebrows unfrozen. And yet, amid all this hardship, the peasants did not surrender. They patched the cracks in their mud and dung walls with moss and rags, they jammed holes with sheep's wool or stuffed old cloaks into gaps where the wind laughed through. They leaned against one another, sharing warmth the way modern people might share stories or jokes. Their houses were more wind tunnel than shelter, their roofs sagging thatch that welcomed rain, snow and the occasional squirrel, yet they stayed. They endured. Floors were dirt, so when rain poured or snow melted, water seeped up, turning the house into a marsh, making every step indoors as chilling as trudging through a frozen swamp. But instead of collapsing, peasants spread straw, spread rushes, spread anything that could provide a fragile barrier between their bare feet and the icy earth. The hearth was their lifeline, a smoky, stubborn pit of fire in the centre of the room. There were no chimneys. Smoke curled wherever it pleased, often straight into lungs, coating rafters black, fumigating fleas by accident. But that fire was the heart of survival. Families stoked it, banked its embers under ash, tended it in shifts through the night. They argued over techniques, passed down secrets as though fire banking were a sacred art, and indeed it was, for to lose the fire was to risk losing your life. They slept around it like planets circling a tiny sun, elders and infants closest, strong youths at the edges, where cold stabbed hardest. Sometimes they invited their animals inside, not from affection, but from sheer necessity. Cows radiated heat like living stoves. Goats wandered in whether wanted or not. Pigs rooted noisily in corners. Chickens clucked from rafters. The smell was legendary, but so was the warmth. Families pressed themselves together on straw pallets, Human lasagna layered cheek to jowl, their body heat combining into a shared fortress against frost. They breathe shallowly through their noses, careful not to gulp too much icy air into their lungs, teaching children to master survival breathing before they could master their letters. They ate heavy stews thick with root vegetables, rye bread dense as stone, salted pork when fortune smiled because food was fuel, warmth born from digestion itself. There were heated stones pulled from the fire, wrapped and tucked into beds like crude hot water bottles. There were hay boxes, wooden chests lined with straw, keeping food warm and sometimes keeping hearts alive with small midnight snacks. There was dirt and grease caked into clothing, filth turned into insulation, a medieval Gore-Tex born not from design but from necessity. There were prayers whispered beneath rafters, candles lit against darkness, chalk marks on doorways to beg the saints for mercy, for one more sunrise. And still, winter sometimes won. Roofs collapsed, families froze in each other's arms, diseases thrived in smoky, cramped huts. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes, famine stalked villages until bark and leather became desperate meals. Yet in the face of this toothlessness, peasants persisted. They survived one more night, one more storm, leaving behind a legacy of endurance that, though unsung, built the very foundation of our warm and comfortable modern lives. Every blanket you pull over yourself, every pane of glass that keeps the wind out, every soft bed you sink into, all of it was purchased by centuries of struggle, by nameless peasants who would not give in. And so, as the wind howls outside your double-pane window tonight, remember them. Remember the stubborn, the nameless, the frost-bitten survivors who pressed their shoulders to thin mud walls and prayed into the dark. Remember the peasants who turned survival into a story, who transformed shivering existence into a living legacy. Their story is not just about cold, it is about us, and it is about the ember that never quite died, the ember we still carry, one breath, one heartbeat, one stubborn act of survival at a time. The cold was not only in the air, but in the bones of the land itself, a presence that wrapped around everything, that seeped up from the earth and pressed down from the sky as if winter had hands, and those hands never tired of squeezing tighter. For a medieval peasant, the night was not an interval between days, it was a battlefield where every breath was contested. Imagine lying on a straw mattress that flattened long ago, feeling the icy damp crawl upward from the ground like invisible fingers. The fire in the hearth burned low, not for lack of desire but for lack of fuel, for every stick of wood had been carried on weary backs from hedgerows and thickets, every twig guarded as if it were treasure. And in that dim red glow the family huddled, wrapped not only in wool cloaks but in one another, in the fragile promise that if they pressed close enough they might trick the night into sparing them. The hut itself was alive with sound. The wind whistled through cracks, sending the walls shuddering with each gust, making it feel as though the entire world outside was trying to step in. The roof sagged and creaked, thatch dripping with meltwater that fell in slow, cold drops onto sleeping faces. In the corner, a cow shifted heavily, her warm breath clouding in the air like steam, a reminder that she too was part of the survival pact. Goats muttered softly, chickens stirred restlessly on their makeshift roosts, pigs grunted from beneath a heap of straw. The mingled smells of smoke, sweat, animal, hide, and damp earth clung to every surface, so strong that it became invisible to those who lived inside, their noses numbed by familiarity. Children whimpered in their sleep, pressing their faces into their mother's arms, and she, though exhausted from hours of labour in fields stiff with frost, whispered old prayers, not eloquent ones, not the polished Latin of priests, but rough, heartfelt words that rose like smoke into the rafters. Please God, keep the fire alive. Please God, let the roof hold. Please God, let us wake in the morning. Faith was not separate from life, it was woven through every frozen moment, because when the world itself seemed bent on swallowing you in silence, hope was the only warmth the cold could not take. Outside, the village was quiet, every hut holding its own desperate vigil. From some roofs, thin smoke curled, from others none, and neighbours noticed. The absence of smoke was as dangerous as the absence of breath. In the deep of night, someone might stumble across the snow to share a coal wrapped in cloth, or to knock on a door and beg for a spark. Fire was currency, fire was life, fire was a bond between households that turned strangers into kin. The act of sharing it was sacred, a ritual older than memory. And yet, for all the fear, there was laughter too. Around the hearth, when the worst of the cold was pushed back for a little while, voices rose in song, in stories, in half-forgotten tales of saints and wanderers. Children learned riddles, grandparents told of winters even harsher than this one. and in the telling there was a strange kind of comfort. If others had survived before, perhaps they too would see another spring. The flicker of flame became a stage, shadows dancing on walls of mud and dung, transforming the hut into a theatre where imagination warmed what fire could not. Their clothing, though rough and worn, became second skins. A tunic might be patched a dozen times, each stitch a memory, each tear a reminder of work in fields or woodlands. Cloaks smelled of goat because goats had given their wool, their warmth woven into fabric that scratched the skin but saved the body. Dirt and grease, caked in layers, sealed tiny gaps in cloth until garments became strangely windproof, a technology born of neglect but turned into strategy. To bathe in midwinter would be folly, to stay grimy was wisdom. Children giggled when their hands left smudges on walls, but mothers nodded knowingly. Filth was survival. The meals were humble yet deliberate. A thick stew simmered over embers, filling the air with the earthy scent of turnip and barley, perhaps a shred of meat if fortune or festival had been kind. Every bite was not just food, but fuel, a small fire lit inside the belly. Parents urged children to eat more, to take another hunk of bread, because warmth tomorrow depended on fullness tonight. Hunger was the cold's closest ally, and peasants knew it too well. Better to sleep heavy and dream wild dreams than to sleep empty and not wake at all. And when the night grew too long, when fatigue pressed heavy but fire needed tending, they slept in shifts. A father poked the coals while his son snored, then dozed while his daughter added straw, then stirred awake when a draught found its way through the patched door. It was clumsy, imperfect, but it kept embers alive until dawn, and that was all that mattered. The rhythm of survival was not smooth, but it was enough. Winter was cruel, yes, but it was also a teacher. It taught patience, for the snow did not melt at human command. It taught humility, for no man or woman, however strong, could face it alone. It taught gratitude, for every morning breath was a small miracle, every flicker of fire a blessing, every bowl of steaming stew a triumph of life over silence. And so in huts scattered across the countryside, peasants endured, not as nameless shadows, but as guardians of a flame, as the stubborn pulse of humanity refusing to be snuffed out. The night outside stretched endless and heavy, but inside those fragile huts life clung stubbornly to its rhythm, breath after breath, ember after ember. The walls might shake with every gust and the roof might moan beneath the weight of snow, yet inside there was always movement, always the quiet dance of survival. A mother shifted closer to the fire, tucking her child more deeply beneath her cloak. A father whispered to his eldest son about the fields buried under frost, about how even now in the dark the seed of next year's harvest slept deep within the soil, waiting for warmth to return. In those whispers was a kind of faith, a reminder that the cold was not the end, only a chapter that would pass. The hearth was more than heat, it was the centre of existence. Its smoke curled through the dim air, stinging eyes and coating rafters, yet also driving away vermin and parasites. The glow of its coals marked the line between life and death. Around it, families found their shape, arranging themselves in concentric circles of need. The elderly closest to warmth, the infants tucked in tight, the strong at the edges where the draughts prowled. They joked about being human shields, laughed at the goats that refused to stay in the corner, cursed at the pigs who sprawled like kings on the warmest patches of earth. Even misery, when shared, created bonds that nothing could break. Sleep was not gentle. It came in fits, in sudden drops into exhaustion, then in sharp awakenings when the cold nipped too close or the fire hissed a warning. Dreams were filled with strange images, shaped by hunger and smoke, by the heaviness of root vegetables in the belly and the restless murmur of animals. Children dreamed of endless fields of bread, of rivers flowing with milk, of hearths that never sputtered out. Adults dreamed of spring, of green shoots breaking frost, of sunlight warm enough to kiss the earth awake again. Each dream was a rebellion, a promise that life would not bow to the night, and yet fear was always there, crouching in the shadows. Fear of frostbite, of waking to find toes stiff and blackened, fingers too numb to grasp. Fear of sickness that thrived in cold huts, coughing that rattled deep in the chest until breath grew thin. Fear of roofs collapsing under snow, of wolves howling in the distance and creeping closer to hungry animals. But fear did not paralyze them. It sharpened their awareness, taught them to watch the embers, to listen for changes in the wind, to keep children wrapped tight and to pray a little harder before closing their eyes. When dawn finally came, it was no explosion of light, only a slow grey seepage through holes in the roof. But even that was triumph. Another night survived. Another chance to rise stiffly, to stamp warmth back into frozen feet, to stretch hands toward the fire and coax it into life again. Breakfast was humble, perhaps a crust of rye bread, perhaps porridge if there were oats left, but it was eaten with gratitude, with the knowledge that each bite had carried them through the long dark. Outside, the village stirred cautiously. Smoke reappeared from chimneys and roof holes. Neighbours called across snow-covered lanes. Children laughed briefly before their voices were hushed. Every family compared its survival quietly, scanning faces to see who was missing, who had not lasted the night. And when someone had gone, when a hut fell silent and no smoke rose, grief mingled with acceptance. Winter always demanded its toll, but still the others pressed forward, because survival itself was an act of defiance, and to stop was to surrender. The landscape beyond the village was silent too, fields blanketed in white, hedgerows bowed low, rivers frozen in place. Yet beneath the ice, life still waited. The peasants knew it, felt it, trusted it, for without that faith despair would have swallowed them long ago. Their eyes read the land like a scripture, every drift and shadow a verse promising that spring, however distant, would come again. At some night, prayers returned with the darkness. Some families sprinkled holy water near the door, others traced chalk symbols over lintels, pleading with saints to guard them. Stories passed of miracles, of huts spared from collapse, of fires that burned without fuel, of children healed by whispered invocations. Whether true or not, the telling mattered. Hope mattered. Without it, the nights would have been too long, too cruel, too empty. So they endured, winter after winter, shaping a legacy that was not written in books but carved into the marrow of generations. The peasants may not have had crowns or titles, but they had something greater. The fierce endurance to face the coldest nights and to rise again with the dawn. Their story is not one of glory, but of survival, and in that survival lies the seed of everything we know today. The day was only a pale blur of light that lingered behind grey clouds, and when it faded once more into evening, the same fears crept back into every doorway. The cold had no mercy. It prowled like a patient predator, slipping through gaps in thatch, rising up through damp soil floors, pressing its weight on tired shoulders. The peasants learned not to ask for warmth, only for survival. Yet survival itself became an art, a carefully balanced practice of gathering fuel, sharing space, stretching food, and guarding the fragile flame at the heart of each home. Fuel was never plentiful. A peasant family could not rely on endless stacks of logs. Instead, they gathered twigs, branches, dried peat cut from bogs, and when even that ran low, they scavenged for anything that would burn. Bundles of sticks tied with coarse rope were carried on aching backs through snow and mud, each piece destined to vanish in a few minutes of fire. Children were sent out to comb hedgerows for fallen branches, their fingers red and stiff, their breath clouding the air, learning early that each twig could mean the difference between warmth and frostbite. The sound of cracking wood in the hearth was not just comfort, it was a victory drumbeat, proof that for another moment the cold was being held at bay. And yet the smoke was its own enemy. It hung low, filling the hut with a haze that made eyes water and lungs ache. Coughs rattled in the chests of the old, children wheezed in their sleep, but no one dared complain. Better smoke than silence, better stinging eyes than frozen limbs. The rafters grew black with soot, every surface marked by the slow writing of countless fires. That blackness was history itself, recording years of struggle, years of survival. At night, the world outside seemed endless. Wolves howled in the forests, their voices riding the wind, chilling in their closeness. Foxes prowled the edges of the village, hungry and daring, while owls hooted from unseen perches. The snow gleamed faintly beneath the moon, a vast mirror reflecting cold light into the huts. Sometimes footsteps were heard, crunching in drifts, not always human, and children pulled blankets tighter when parents whispered that the animals were watching. Yet within the fragile walls, life pressed on. Families told stories, voices hushed but urgent, stories of saints who endured greater trials, of ancestors who had faced winters harsher still. Each tale was a shield, each word a stone in the fortress of hope. Clothing was layered again and again, a patchwork of rough wool, old skins, rags tied together with cord. Gloves were mismatched scraps of leather, hats pulled low, cloaks heavy with the smell of damp earth and animal musk. Feet were wrapped in cloth, stuffed into clogs, layered until walking was stiff and awkward. The peasants looked like bundles of fabric held together by sheer will, but they did not care. Elegance had no place in the war against the cold. Their fashion was survival, their perfume smoke and sweat, their jewellery the red flush of blood still flowing in their cheeks. Meals, though simple, carried a weight far beyond nourishment. A pot of stew simmering over the fire was a promise. You will not starve tonight. Root vegetables softened in water, grains thickened into porridge, sometimes herbs were added for flavour, and on the rarest nights a scrap of salted meat turned the pot into a feast. The steam of Sudan filled the room with scent, and in those moments hunger gave way to gratitude. Children dipped crusts of bread, licked spoons, and leaned back with full bellies, their eyes already heavy with sleep. Parents exchanged tired glances, knowing that the food would not last long, but that at least tonight their family was safe. Then came the ritual of settling for the night. Straw was spread or shaken, cloaks arranged, bodies pressed close together. The youngest were tucked into the centre, the strongest placed at the edges, a living wall of flesh and bone against the drafts. Livestock shifted in their corners, adding their own warmth to the shared breath of the hut. The fire was banked carefully, ash folded over embers like a blanket, and prayers were whispered in low voices. Some traced small crosses in the air, others muttered charms passed down from forgotten elders, but all carried the same plea: let the fire live, let us live with it. Sleep came unevenly. A crack in the roof might drop cold water on a forehead, a goat might stir suddenly, a pig grunt loud enough to wake the room. Sometimes a child coughed through the night, and parents lay awake counting each breath, fearing the sickness that could spread like shadow through a family. And yet even broken sleep was precious. It meant another hour survived, another step through the labyrinth of winter. And so the peasants endured, their lives bound to the rhythm of frost and flame, their nights measured not by hours, but by how long the embers lasted. They did not seek comfort, they sought continuation, and in that pursuit they revealed a resilience that humbles us even now. For in their cracked hands and weary eyes lived the proof that humanity, though fragile, is unyielding, and that even in the coldest dark the will to endure is stronger than ice, stronger than fear, stronger than the night itself. The cold carved itself into memory, not as a passing sensation but as a constant companion, a shadow that followed peasants from dawn to dusk and back again. Even when the sun appeared weakly through the grey sky, it offered little warmth, only a faint light that glistened on frozen thatch and turned puddles to mirrors of ice. Each step outside the hut was heavy, boots crunching into frost, the air so sharp it stung the throat, yet still the people moved. They gathered what could be gathered, carried bundles of wood, fetched water cracked from the edge of frozen streams, fed animals that stared back with wide, patient eyes. Their days were labour, their nights endurance, and in between there was never true rest, only a constant watchfulness. The huts themselves were like wounded creatures, patched and repatched, with whatever could be found. Moss stuffed into cracks, rags nailed against gaps, bundles of straw jammed between beams. Some families smeared more mud and dung against the walls each season, shaping a new skin over the old one, until the house seemed to wear layers like the people inside it. Roofs sagged under snow, leaking drops into corners, but each leak was tended with desperate creativity. A cloth here, a board there, sometimes even a handful of turf stolen from a neighbour's field. The houses were not elegant, but they stood, and that was all that mattered. Inside, the floor was a battlefield of cold, dirt pressed upward, sucking warmth from bare feet, and so the peasants layered it with rushes, straw, whatever they could find. The rushes decomposed, becoming damp, becoming alive with insects, but still they were spread again and again. Each fresh layer smelled briefly of green meadows, of herbs mixed in to mask the stench before turning back to rot. And yet even that decay was preferable to the icy ground. Children played among the rushes by day, and by night they curled upon them, finding what comfort they could in the fragile barrier between flesh and frost. The hearth glowed in the centre, the fire always the heart of the household. It spat sparks, hissed at damp wood, breathed smoke like a dragon too weary to flee, yet it gave light, it gave heat, it gave life. Families learned the delicate craft of fire banking, folding ash over coals so that by morning a tiny ember might still glow, ready to be coaxed into flame again. Arguments brewed over technique, each elder swearing their way was best. But the truth was that every family prayed in their own fashion, and every ember that survived till dawn was a shared triumph. Around the fire, stories grew, gossip flowed, and songs rose. The children leaned forward wide-eyed, listening to tales of saints, of wanderers, of heroes who had faced winters harsher still. Their stories were as much insulation as cloaks, weaving warmth into minds when bodies could find little. The animals were part of the family, whether welcomed or not. Cows exhaled clouds of heat, goats butted into corners, pigs sprawled in straw, chickens clucked softly from rafters. Their noises blended with the crackle of fire, forming a lullaby strange yet familiar. The smell was heavy, pungent, unrelenting, but to those who lived among it, it became the perfume of survival. Better the stink of beast than the silence of an empty hut. Children sometimes giggled at the chaos of it all, waking in the night to find a goat's nose pressed close, or a chicken fluttering down onto a straw bed. Parents shushed them, smiling despite themselves, because laughter was warmth too, fleeting yet precious. Meals bound the family together. A pot hung over the fire, filled with whatever the season still allowed. Parsnips, turnips, cabbage, onions, barley, oats. Sometimes salted meat was stirred in, sometimes only a bone to flavour the broth. Yet when steam filled the hut, it felt like abundance. Bowls were passed, crusts dipped, spoons scraped, and in those moments hunger loosened its grip. Parents urged children to eat heartily, to finish their portion, to remember that food was more than comfort, it was fuel against the night. The act of eating became an act of faith, that the body would hold against the cold, that strength would endure until the thaw. As the night deepened, the rituals repeated. The fire was fed, the animals quieted, the children wrapped tightly, the adults layered in every scrap of fabric they owned. Breathing grew shallow, careful, measured, each inhalation a defence against the icy air that threatened to cut into lungs. Families pressed close, body heat mingling, creating a human shield against the drafts that slipped under doors and through walls. Sleep came unevenly, punctuated by the need to stir the embers, to patch a leak, to comfort a coughing child. But sleep, however ragged, was still survival. And when morning came again with its pale grey light, with frost still clinging to every surface, with breath still clouding in the air, the peasants rose. They stretched their stiff limbs, rubbed life back into numb hands, and turned once more to the tasks that kept them alive. They had not conquered winter, but they had endured another night, and endurance in their world was the greatest victory. The nights of the medieval world were long beyond measure, longer in feeling than in hours, stretching with a kind of weight that pressed against the mind as much as the body. The peasant who stepped out from his hut at dusk knew that darkness was not a gentle curtain but an enemy, a cloak beneath which cold gathered and waited. The breath left his lips in white clouds, the snow beneath his boots groaned and shifted, and all around the land seemed still, as if holding itself in a frozen grip. There was no hum of distant traffic, no golden lamps to pierce the shadows, only the faint glimmer of stars when clouds allowed, and the pale gleam of moonlight across the fields. Into that silence, even the smallest sound became enormous. The bark of a dog, the cry of an owl, the long howl of wolves somewhere beyond the tree line. And so he hurried back into the hut, pulling the door tight against its frame of wood and straw, letting the darkness remain outside. Inside, life huddled close to the hearth. The fire was never strong, never more than a bundle of sticks coaxed into reluctant flame, but its glow was everything. Around it the family gathered, faces ruddy in the flickering light, eyes half closed from smoke, bodies pressed together to steal every possible degree of warmth. The walls shuddered with each gust, sending fine trails of snow through hidden gaps, but no one moved away from the fire. To leave its circle was to surrender yourself to the cold. The floor beneath them was layered with rushes, flattened from months of trampling, damp from melted snow that seeped up from the earth. It gave off a smell sharp and sour, mixed with the musk of animals and the tang of smoke. No one complained. Complaints changed nothing. Instead they spread fresh layers whenever they could, cutting reeds in summer and drying them, scattering them in winter to keep the mud at bay. Children crawled across them, scratching at bites from unseen insects, and mothers hushed them gently, knowing that even in filth there was a kind of shield. The bedding was straw too, piled into sacks or spread onto wooden frames if fortune allowed. Each rustle as someone shifted sent a crackle into the air, each stalk poking at skin, a reminder that comfort was not part of the bargain. Fleas came with the straw, biting at ankles and wrists, yet still families sank gratefully into it. Because between straw and frozen earth the choice was simple. Straw, for all its misery, was life. Clothing remained on through the night, every layer, every scrap, every rag. Tunics rough against the skin, cloaks heavy with the smell of goat, caps pulled down to the eyebrows. Hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, feet stuffed into clogs lined with rags. Dirt and grease clung to everything, thickening the fabric until it became oddly resistant to the wind. A strange blessing, this filth, for to be clean was to be cold, and to be cold was to risk never waking. Children bundled in layers looked like awkward turnips, waddling in the dark, and parents smiled at their clumsy steps because clumsiness meant warmth, and warmth meant hope. Meals before bed were thick, heavy and simple. A pot hung over the fire, its contents bubbling slowly, the steam filling the hut with a smell earthy and strong. Turnips, onions, barley, oats, sometimes cabbage, sometimes beans. Meat was rare but treasured. Salted pork or dried sausage stirred in when celebration or slaughter allowed. Each spoonful landed heavy in the stomach, a weight that promised heat through the long night. Parents urged children to eat more, even when they wrinkled their noses. Eat, they said, for hunger makes the cold sharper. Eat, for the food will keep you warm from inside. When bellies were full and eyelids heavy, the night's ritual began. The fire was banked, ash drawn carefully over embers until they glowed like stars hidden beneath clouds. The youngest children were tucked deep into the nest of cloaks, their tiny breaths puffing in rhythm, their bodies safe in the centre of the huddle. Elders were drawn close too, bones stiff, voices whispering prayers. The strongest lay at the edges, shoulders squared against the drafts, eyes half open to watch the coals. Animals shifted in corners, their warmth mingling with human breath, their sounds a reminder that survival was a shared burden. Sleep came in shifts, no one dared let the fire die. A father rose after a few hours, stirring the ash, feeding the flame with a stick or two. Then a son took his place, then a mother, then an older daughter. Even children old enough to hold a stick were given turns, learning early that warmth was everyone's duty. Outside the wind raged, rattling doors and clawing at roofs, but inside the ember survived, and so the family survived. And when dawn crept in, not with brilliance, but with a grey wash of light across the snow, the family stirred stiffly. Limbs ached, eyes burned, throats rasped from smoke, yet breath still came, and breath was victory. Breakfast was meagre, bread hard as stone, porridge thin as water, but it was shared with gratitude. The day ahead would demand more labour, more gathering, more watching of the sky, but for now there was relief. Another night had been endured. The village too rose with dawn. Thin trails of smoke began to curl upward from rooftops. Dogs barked, cocks crowed. Neighbours checked on one another with cautious glances, noting whose chimneys smoked, whose doors remained shut, whose huts lay too quiet. If one family had not made it, the others knew soon enough. Silence spoke louder than cries. But when everyone emerged, stamping life back into stiff legs, exchanging weary greetings, a fragile joy rippled through the village. Life had endured again, not gloriously, not comfortably, but stubbornly. The peasants knew that winter was not a single enemy, but a season-long siege. It wore them down day after day, night after night, with hunger and frost and sickness. Yet they also knew that every day survived brought spring closer. In that knowledge lay strength. They did not look for miracles, only for endurance, and endurance itself became their miracle. The day never felt long enough, and yet it dragged with a heaviness that made every chore a trial. Men trudged to cut wood, their axes striking frozen branches with dull thuds, hands stinging from the shock of each blow. Women carried buckets from wells, their fingers stiff around rope handles, the water sloshing and freezing at the edges before they even reached their huts. Children gathered rushes, picked through piles of straw, helped herd animals into shelter before the next storm. No moment was idle, because idleness was a luxury no one could afford. The cold punished those who hesitated, and so the rhythm of the day was steady, relentless, without pause. And yet in this rhythm there was a strange kind of comfort. Each task was known, each act repeated from generations past. They were not inventing survival anew each winter, but rehearsing an old lesson, one taught by parents and grandparents, carried like an inheritance. The way to bank a fire, the best herbs to throw on rushes to mask the stench, the angle at which to lean straw against a leaking roof, all these details were knowledge passed down, treasures greater than gold. Children absorbed them without question, learning with their hands as much as their ears, because the wisdom of survival could not be left to words alone. In the evenings, when work was done and light faded, the village sometimes gathered. Not outside, for the air was merciless, but in one or two of the larger huts, families pressed together, neighbours squeezed shoulder to shoulder, and the room swelled with voices. Songs rose, rough and tuneless perhaps, but full of heart. Laughter echoed, muffled by scarves and cloaks, but real. Stories stretched longer in those moments, because they were shared not by one family, but by many, weaving a net of hope strong enough to hold the weight of the cold. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of beasts that prowled the forests, of saints who protected villages, of ancestors who had survived famines so harsh that even bark and leather were eaten. And in those tales lay the unspoken promise, if they endured, so could you. Faith pulsed through everything. It was not a grand cathedral faith, gilded with gold and sung by choirs, but a humble, desperate faith whispered into the dark. Families prayed as they lay down to sleep, they prayed as they stirred the fire. They prayed as they pressed their lips to the cold foreheads of their children. Every cough was met with a plea, every gust of wind with a muttered invocation. Saints were called upon to guard throats, to keep roofs from collapsing, to chase away sickness. Holy water sprinkled near the hearth, chalk marks on doorways, candles lit and left to burn until morning. All were small shields against the enormity of the season. But faith alone could not fill bellies. Hunger was a companion almost as constant as cold. Fields lay barren beneath snow, stores dwindled, and every meal was measured carefully. Bread was cut thinner, stew stretched with more water, porridge thinned until it barely clung to the spoon. Parents went hungry so that children might eat, and still the cold gnawed at their insides. In the leanest winters, famine pressed its weight upon the village, and stories told of people eating whatever they could find, roots, bark, boiled leather. Yet even then, some clung to life, teeth clenched, refusing to let winter claim them. Sickness came on silent feet, slipping through the smoke-thick air of huts. A cough that would have been simple in summer became deadly in winter. Pneumonia, fever, chills. These took as many as frostbite and hunger. Villages lost elders, sometimes children, sometimes entire families. Grief was sharp, but it was also brief, because the living could not linger long in mourning. To survive was to keep moving, to keep tending fires, to keep drawing water and gathering wood. The dead were buried beneath frozen earth, or in shallow graves until thaw allowed more, and prayers were whispered quickly before shovels turned again to fuel survival. And yet, despite it all, there were moments of beauty. The sky on a clear night stretched vast and endless, stars scattering light so sharp it seemed to cut the air. The snow, untouched, gleamed with a silver glow, reflecting moonlight like glass. Children laughed as they chased one another through drifts, falling and rising again, their cheeks flushed red, their laughter defying the stillness. Even the howl of wolves had a strange majesty, a reminder that the world was larger than huts and fields, that nature had its own fierce life beyond the reach of men. Families clung to such moments, a spark of laughter, a song hummed in the dark, the feel of a child's small hand warm in a parent's palm. These were treasures that no cold could steal. They did not erase the misery, but they made it bearable, and in their own way they were more powerful than fire. For the ember of hope burned brighter than wood, and it did not fade with dawn. Night after night winter pressed on, and night after night peasants endured, stitching together their survival with rags, prayers, laughter, and sheer stubbornness. They did not conquer the cold, but they did not yield to it either. They lived within its grasp, but they lived. And in that endurance lies the truest story of all, not of knights or kings, but of nameless people who, in the darkest nights, kept the ember alive. The struggle against the night did not belong only to single families, but to the whole village, for everyone knew that no one survived winter alone. If the fire in one hut died, it was a neighbour who carried a glowing coal wrapped in rags across the snow. If the roof of one house sagged too low, others lent their hands and shoulders, shoring it with beams or with sheer human strength. The village was a net, woven tight in the coldest months, each knot a life, each strand a promise. Disputes over land, goats, or borrowed tools might flare in summer, but in the icy grip of January, grudges were shelved. The enemy was not each other, the enemy was the frost. Children too played their part. They carried bundles of kindling smaller than their arms, fetched rushes for the floors, and watched the fires with solemn eyes. They learned early that every task mattered. To be careless with embers was to risk more than scolding. It was to risk the lives of everyone around you. Their small hands shook as they practiced striking flint, coaxing sparks into dry tinder, their breath held until flame caught. When it did, when fire leapt from spark, their faces glowed with triumph. In that glow was the passing of knowledge, the quiet inheritance that bound generations together. The animals remained central to survival. A cow's warm flank pressed against the wall radiated heat through the night. Goats, restless and stubborn, wormed their way closer to the hearth no matter how many times they were shoved aside. Pigs rooted noisily in straw, oblivious to the needs of humans but generous in the warmth their bodies shed. Chickens clucked softly above, their feathers ruffled in the smoky air. These beasts were not pets, they were survival partners. Each breath they shared another shield against the cold. The smell that rose from such crowded company was overwhelming, but the peasants scarcely noticed. Their senses dulled to it, their hearts fixed on warmth rather than fragrance. There were dangers too. Fire, so precious, was also a hazard. Sparks leapt onto straw, onto cloaks, onto hair. More than one hut was lost to flames in winter, when a single careless ember found too eager a home. Families lived in constant tension, worshipping the fire even as they feared it. They prayed over it, banked it carefully, guarded it through the night, for without it the cold would claim them faster than hunger. Food stores dwindled as weeks dragged on. The salted meat grew scarce, the dried beans fewer, the grain sacks lighter. Each meal was smaller than the last, stretched thinner with water, flavoured with herbs when meat was gone. Parents pretended to be full, pushing bowls toward children, their eyes hollow but their voices steady. Children learned not to ask for more. They chewed crusts until their jaws ached, swallowed porridge that was more water than oat, and smiled bravely because their parents told them to. Hunger was an ache that never left, a weight in the belly that pressed day and night, and yet even that ache became familiar, a companion as constant as cold. Illness crept easily into weary bodies. A cough lingered, a fever rose, and suddenly a strong man or woman was too weak to rise. The smoky air, thick with dampness, only worsened it. Remedies were simple: hot onion teas, herbs steeped in water, whispered prayers, and the laying on of hands. Sometimes these worked, sometimes not. Death was a neighbour too, always near, always watching. But when someone passed, the village mourned swiftly, then turned back to the fight. There was no room for long grief. To live was to keep going even when hearts ached. And yet, amid this darkness, resilience burned. Families found joy in small things, the way frost painted patterns on a wooden door, shining silver in firelight. The sound of laughter echoing through smoke when a child said something silly. The hush that fell when someone sang, their voice cracking but clear, carrying words older than memory. These moments were treasures, tiny sparks against the great dark, and they mattered as much as bread or fire. For hope, once kindled, warmed the soul as surely as flame warmed the hands. Spring was far away, hidden beyond weeks of frost, but peasants carried it in their hearts. Each dawn survived was a step closer. Each ember that glowed at sunrise was proof that life continued. They spoke of it quietly, of fields turning green, of lambs born, of festivals when drums would sound again. Hope was not foolishness. Hope was survival. Without it, the long nights would have crushed them. With it, they endured, and in enduring, they wrote the truest story of the medieval world. A story not of kings or battles, but of ordinary souls who kept breathing through the coldest nights history ever knew. The cold carved stories into every wrinkle of the land, stories that could not be written on parchment, but only lived in the marrow of those who endured. A villager stepping outside at dawn would see fields glittering white, each blade of frozen grass stiff as a blade of iron, each branch of tree bending low beneath its burden of snow. The world seemed sombre, yet in that pavement there was a movement. Smoke rose thinly from rooftops, curling against the grey sky like fragile prayers. Dogs barked, their voices echoing sharp and brittle. Somewhere a rooster crowed, though even his call sounded hoarse in the frozen air. Life persisted, always, even when the cold pressed down like an endless weight. The people moved slowly, bundled in layer after layer, until their forms seemed shapeless. They carried buckets of water that froze at the edges before reaching the door, dragged bundles of firewood, tended animals huddled in stalls no warmer than the huts themselves. Breath steamed before their faces, frost clung to eyebrows and hair, but still they laboured. To stop moving was to surrender, and so each day was a march, each chore another small battle in the long war against winter. Inside the huts, the rhythm of survival continued. The hearth glowed faintly, coals coaxed into flame with patient breath and careful hands. Children crouched close, eyes wide, watching sparks leap upward. Their faces were smudged with soot, their hair thick with the smell of smoke, yet their laughter rang clear when the flame caught, when warmth spread once more. They knew already what it meant. Without fire there was no life. The lesson was not taught with words, but with every night endured, every morning when their limbs ached from cold. The elders spoke often in these hours, their voices low, their words heavy with memory. They told of winters harsher than this one, when snow buried huts to their roofs, when famine turned villages into ghostly shadows. They spoke not to frighten, but to remind. Survival was possible, even in the worst of years. Children listened with solemn faces, memorizing each tale, each warning, each trick for keeping frost from creeping too far. These stories were more than entertainment. They were a living handbook, passed from tongue to ear, binding generations together like threads in a cloak. Meals were the gathering point of every day. A pot hung over the fire, its contents bubbling faintly, the smell filling the air with earthy heaviness. A stew of roots and grains, thickened as best as possible, seasoned with salt if any remained. On rare days a piece of meat, salted or smoked, transformed the pot into a banquet. Families gathered close, bowls in hand, eating slowly, savouring every bite. Children licked spoons clean, scraped bowls until nothing was left, their hunger easing for a while. Parents, even when hungry, gave the larger portions to the youngest, exchanging glances that spoke of both sacrifice and love. And after meals came songs, rough, unpolished, carried in voices hoarse from smoke yet beautiful in their persistence. Old songs, songs of saints and seasons, songs that tied the present to the past. The sound filled the hut, rose into the rafters, mingled with smoke, and drifted out into the night. In those songs, the peasants remembered that they were not alone, that countless generations had sung the same words, endured the same nights, and emerged into spring once more. The nights remained long, pressing down with the weight of silence. Families huddled tighter, bodies pressed so close that they could feel one another's hearts beating beneath layers of wool and straw. Children slept in the middle, their small bodies radiating warmth. Elders dozed fitfully, waking often to tend the fire, to shift aching limbs, to listen for the howl of wolves beyond the walls. The fire sputtered and smoked, but its glow painted every face in red and gold, a fragile sun that kept the night at bay. Sometimes, in the deepest hours, fear crept in. A sudden silence outside, broken only by the crack of shifting ice. A creak in the roof that groaned under snow. A cough that rattled too long in a child's chest. In those moments prayers rose, whispered urgently, spilling into the smoky air. Saints were called upon, God's mercy begged for, promises made in exchange for another dawn. The hut became a chapel, the fire an altar, every breath a hymn. Faith was not distant in those nights. It was woven into survival itself. When dawn returned, pale and weak, it was greeted with relief. Another night survived, another step closer to spring. Children stirred slowly, rubbing eyes crusted with smoke, reaching for crusts of bread or bowls of porridge. Parents rose stiffly, stretching sore backs, checking the fire, tending animals, preparing for another day. There was no celebration, only quiet persistence. For peasants knew the truth. Survival was not won in great victories, but in countless small ones, day after day, night after night. And so the cycle continued. Work, eat, pray, sleep, endure. Each day bled into the next, each night another test. Yet through it all they held fast. The ember glowed, the prayers rose, the songs echoed, and life endured. This was the triumph of the peasant. Not glory, not comfort, but endurance. And in that endurance lies a story greater than any tale of kings, for it is the story of humanity itself refusing to be broken by the cold. The winter did not loosen its grip quickly, for it was not a guest but a ruler, and peasants lived beneath its rule with bowed heads and clenched jaws. Day after day the sky remained iron grey, the ground frozen as stone, the air biting enough to cut through every ragged cloak. Yet still the rhythm continued, a stubborn beat that no frost could silence. Men trudged to gather fuel, women tended children and animals, elders kept watch over the hearth, and children learned by doing, their small hands red and cracked from labour. It was a life of endless repetition, yet repetition was the very thing that carried them through. The huts, patched again and again, became fortresses not of strength, but of sheer will, each gap stuffed with moss, each hole plastered with dung, each sagging beam propped up with sticks. When the wind howled, the walls shivered, but the people inside pressed closer together, defying the storm with their presence. The smoke from the hearth thickened the air, stung eyes and throats, yet even in its choking presence there was comfort. the blackened rafters, the soot-streaked walls, all bore witness to years of fire kept alive, of nights endured. At the centre of every family was the firekeeper. Sometimes it was the father, sometimes the mother, sometimes a grandparent whose bones ached too much for fieldwork. Their task was sacred, to guard the flame, to coax it when it faltered, to bank it beneath ash when the night grew deepest. To lose the fire was to invite death. Children grew up knowing that the hearth was not simply a convenience, but the very heart of life. They watched wide-eyed as sparks caught kindling, as flames licked upward, as warmth spread once more. The fire was their teacher, their guardian, their god in miniature. Food was measured carefully, every crumb accounted for. Grain sacks grew lighter as weeks passed. Salted meat shrank, vegetables dwindled to wrinkled remnants. Each meal was stretched thinner, flavoured with hope more than with herbs. Parents lied to their children with smiles, claiming they had eaten already, pressing larger portions into smaller hands. Hunger gnawed at their insides, but the sight of a child chewing with contentment was worth the ache. Hunger became a constant, an uninvited companion. But still they endured, because to endure was the only choice. Illness stalked the huts like a shadow. Coughs deepened, fevers rose, joints stiffened. Smoke and dampness fed the sickness, and there were no doctors to summon. No medicine beyond herbs steeped in boiling water and whispered prayers. Sometimes these worked, sometimes not. The loss of a child, an elder, a neighbour, was met with grief, but grief was brief. Tears fell, prayers rose, and then hands returned to work. Survival allowed no long mourning. Death was too common to be a stranger. It was another part of life, a reminder whispered by the wind at every door. Yet even amid hardship there was laughter. Children found joy in the crunch of snow beneath boots, in chasing chickens that fluttered indignantly through the hut, in pressing their fingers against frosted windows and watching the patterns melt. Adults chuckled when goats stole scraps, when pigs snorted too loudly, when someone slipped on rushes damp from melted snow. These moments were sparks, tiny and fleeting, but enough to remind them that they were alive, that life was more than suffering. Faith wove through everything like a hidden thread. Before sleeping, families whispered prayers, crossing themselves, begging saints to guard their homes. Candles burned low in corners, their wax dripping slowly, their flames trembling but steady. Holy water sprinkled near the hearth, chalk markings renewed on doorframes. Promises were made in desperation, to share more, to forgive grudges, to give thanks if only another dawn would come. Faith was not a ceremony for them, it was breath, it was heartbeat, it was the thing that kept despair from swallowing them whole. The village stood together, each family a strand in the web of survival. When one roof sagged too low, others came to lift it. When one fire faltered, coals were shared. When one family starved, food was pooled. Quarrels remained, old wounds festered, but in winter those wounds were ignored. No feud was greater than the threat of frost. Even children understood this truth, running errands between huts, carrying messages, carrying hope. The community was a shield battered but unbroken, against the cold that sought to destroy them. And always, through every night, through every storm, the ember endured. It glowed faintly in the hearth, hidden beneath ash, waiting to be coaxed into flame. It was more than heat. It was memory. It was promise. It was life itself. And as long as that ember lived, so did they. The cold was endless, yet within its grip the peasants carried an ember of endurance that refused to be extinguished. Each dawn was proof of that refusal. Smoke rose from chimneys like faint banners of victory. Neighbours stepped into the snow to greet one another with tired nods, and life continued. The fields remained barren, animals thin, stores dwindling, but the people still moved, still breathed, still fought against the weight of winter. Their struggle was not glamorous, not celebrated in songs of knights and kings, but it was the truest struggle of all, the struggle simply to live. Children grew up in this battle as soldiers of necessity. Their toys were sticks that doubled as kindling, their games played in snowdrifts that numbed fingers and toes. They learned quickly to wrap cloth around their feet, to breathe shallowly through their noses, to huddle close to the fire without complaint. Hardship carved strength into them before they knew what softness was. Their laughter, sharp and bright in the frozen air, was perhaps the purest defiance of all. Each giggle, each game, each snowball thrown was a declaration. We are still here, we are still alive. The elders bore their years heavily, but their presence was treasure. They remembered winters past, remembered tricks and remedies, remembered who had survived and how. Their words were maps guiding younger generations through the blizzard. They taught how to bank a fire, how to seal a wall with moss, how to stretch food until it seemed impossible to stretch further. They sat near the hearth, their voices rasping with smoke and age, telling stories not only to entertain but to preserve the wisdom of survival. And in the quiet of night, when the wind screamed loudest, their steady murmurs were as comforting as the fire itself. The animals remained companions in struggle. Their breath rose in steaming clouds, their bodies radiated warmth into the smoky air. Cows stood patient, goats restless, pigs snorted in straw, chickens shifted above. Together with humans, they formed a circle of life bound by necessity. The smell, thick and pungent, mattered little compared to the heat. Better a stinking hut alive with breath than a sweet-smelling hut empty and frozen. The peasants understood this instinctively, and so beasts and people endured side by side, each giving what the other needed most. Meals dwindled in size as the weeks passed, but they never lost their significance. A thin stew, a crust of bread, a bowl of porridge, it was enough to gather the family close, enough to warm bellies and hearts alike. Children ate greedily, parents quietly held back their portions, and in that silent sacrifice love spoke louder than words. Hunger hollowed faces, but the glow of firelight revealed determination in every gaze. To eat, even sparingly, was to resist. To share food was to declare that no one would be abandoned. And so the cycle of winter pressed on: work, eat, pray, sleep, endure. The repetition itself was strength, a drumbeat that carried them through long nights and longer days. They did not dream of comfort, only of survival. And yet in that humble dream lay a greatness unseen. For every ember kept alive, every child warmed, every elder tended was a victory greater than any knight's joust, any king's feast. It was the victory of life against the cold, of endurance against despair, of humanity against the silence of winter. The season stretched on like a long shadow, and every villager felt its weight in their bones. The sun appeared rarely, a pale disk that offered no warmth, only the faintest light. Days blended together, marked not by change but by sameness. The crunch of frost underfoot, the hiss of smoke curling through rafters, the steady crackle of fire that never seemed enough. Yet within that sameness lay resilience. Each morning the peasants woke again, shook snow from their roofs, stoked embers back into flame, and faced the cold with the same quiet defiance. The houses themselves groaned beneath the strain of ice and wind. Thatch sagged low, leaking when the snow melted. Walls of mud and stick cracked as frost bit deeper. Every creak in the night felt like a warning, every gust like a hand testing the strength of their fragile shelter. Still the peasants patched and propped, smearing fresh mud onto walls even when their fingers stung with cold, wedging beams against sagging roofs, stuffing gaps with straw until the hut looked more like a giant patchwork quilt than a home. Pride was not in beauty, but in endurance. The house still stood, and so did they. Children learned quickly to live in these spaces. They crawled across straw bedding flattened by countless nights, played with carved wooden figures blackened by smoke, and invented games with stones, bones, and scraps. Their laughter rang in the dimness, filling huts with life more powerful than fire. They did not complain of cold or hunger, for such things were simply the fabric of life. They chased chickens, tugged at goats, and sometimes curled up against the warm flank of a cow, giggling even as their parents scolded gently. Childhood was no less hard than adulthood, but within that hardness it grew strong and bright, like frost flowers blooming on glass. Meals remained the anchor of each day. A pot suspended above the hearth became the heart of the home, its bubbling stew a rhythm that gave structure to time. On good days the stew was thick, flavoured with onions or salted pork. On lean days it was thin gruel, little more than boiled water with a handful of oats. Yet even the humblest meal carried meaning. Families gathered, bowls in hand, heads bowed in brief prayer before eating. Silence fell as spoons scraped, as mouths chewed slowly, as hunger eased for a little while. The pot might be nearly empty, but hearts were filled with the warmth of shared presence. Outside, the land lay hushed and still, yet not without danger. Wolves prowled near villages, their howls slicing through the night, reminding peasants that winter sharpened not only wind, but teeth. To step beyond the safety of huts after sunset was a risk, for both beasts and frost waited eagerly. Yet necessity drove them out. Firewood had to be gathered, water fetched from streams half frozen, snares checked in hope of catching a rabbit or bird. Each venture into the frozen dark was a test of courage, and each return a relief. Elders told stories in those nights, stories of saints and spirits, of miracles and curses, of winter's worst the present and springs that always followed. Children listened wide-eyed, drawing close to the hearth as voices painted images brighter than flames. In those tales they learned not only of the past but of themselves, of the unbroken line of endurance that bound them to ancestors long gone. The stories were more than entertainment. They were lifelines, tying weary hearts to hope. And through it all, the ember remained. Banked carefully each night, coaxed gently each morning, it was the thread that stitched one day to the next. Without it, there would be only darkness, only cold, only silence. With it, there was warmth, there was light, there was life. Families guarded it as fiercely as treasure. For in truth it was treasure, the most precious thing they possessed, the difference between despair and survival. Thus the winter ground on, merciless yet powerless to extinguish the spirit of those who endured it. The peasants bent but did not break. They coughed, they shivered, they hungered, but they also laughed, prayed, sang and loved. Their huts might have been fragile, their meals meagre, their clothes threadbare, but their will was unshakable. Each night survived was a victory, each dawn a triumph. And though the cold still ruled the land, it could not rule their hearts. The villagers did not measure time in hours or minutes, for such luxuries belonged to scholars and kings. Their calendar was marked instead by the rise and fall of light, by the slow arc of seasons, and in winter by the endless count of nights endured. The dawns were pale, weak things creeping across the horizon with little warmth to offer, but they were greeted like old friends. Each sunrise meant the fire had survived, the people had survived, and life had pushed itself one step further along the frozen road. Their homes remained crowded, noisy, smoky, yet within those cramped walls they found companionship strong enough to silence despair. A goat bleated softly in the corner, a pig shuffled in its straw, chickens clucked in uneasy dreams upon their rafters. Children stirred, burrowing closer into piles of blankets and straw, while parents moved stiffly to tend fire and beasts. The smell was heavy, the air thick, the floors damp, but no one complained, for this was the cost of survival. Better smoke and stink than silence and frost. The animals were more than companions, they were guardians of heat. The warm flank of a cow could ease the chill from frozen fingers, the soft bleat of a sheep reassured restless children. Their breath rose into the hut, mingling with human breath, creating a cloud of shared warmth. Without them, peasants knew, the nights would be longer, the cold sharper, the risks greater. They were family, bound not by affection alone but by survival itself. Food remained precious, each grain guarded as if it were gold. Women ground what little remained into flour, men carried water through snow. Children fetched twigs for kindling. Meals were humble, yet they carried the weight of ritual. Stew simmered in the pot, its thin broth stretched with barley or turnip, sometimes flavoured with bones cracked to release the marrow. Bread was dark, dense, heavy, each loaf a labour of hands that kneaded by the dim firelight. When these meals were shared, silence often fell, not out of solemnity but from hunger. The clink of wooden spoons, the slow chewing of tired jaws, the sigh of contentment when the last bite was gone, these were the sounds of endurance. Yet laughter too had its place. Children found humour in the oddest moments. They laughed when goats stole scraps, when a rooster crowed at midnight, when snow drifted through a hole in the roof and landed in someone's bowl. Adults joined them, their deep chuckles rolling out like a balm against the bitter air. Even in hunger, even in cold, they laughed, and that laughter was sharper than any blade the winter carried. At night the wind howled like a chorus of ghosts. It pressed at the shutters, slipped through cracks, clawed at the roof. The fire sputtered, glowing red as embers banked beneath ash. In those hours silence fell heavy. Families pressed together, wrapped in cloaks, blankets, anything that could be layered. They whispered prayers, sang soft songs, told stories of saints and spirits. Faith was no abstraction in those moments. It was woven into every word, every gesture, every hope that the morning would come. Illness crept through huts like a thief. A cough that lingered too long, a fever that burned too hot, a child's breath that rattled in the night. Remedies were simple. Herbs steeped in boiling water, poultices of onion or garlic, whispered blessings, and gentle hands. Sometimes they worked, sometimes not. Death came quietly, wrapped not in drama but in silence. A small body stilled, a breath ceased, a corner of the hut fell forever quiet. Grief was sharp but brief, tears were shed, prayers whispered, and life went on, because it had to. Survival allowed no pause for sorrow, and still the fire endured. Banked beneath ash, coaxed with breath, it glowed stubbornly against the dark. Without it there was nothing, no warmth, no food, no light. With it there was everything. Families guarded it as treasure, passing down the art of firekeeping from parent to child. The ember was their heart, and as long as it beat, so did they. Winter's grip never loosened quickly, but peasants did not ask for quickness. They asked only for another dawn, another day, another chance to endure, and in that simple, stubborn request lay their greatness. They were not kings, not knights, not lords remembered in chronicles, but their story was carved into the very marrow of survival. The world moved forward on their endurance, on their laughter, on their prayers whispered into smoky rafters. The frost did not ask permission, it crept into every corner, every joint, every breath. Peasants knew this truth better than any scholar, for they felt it gnawing at their fingers as they carried water, at their feet as they trudged through snow, at their lungs as each shallow breath turned to mist in the air. Yet they carried on because to stop was to surrender, and surrender meant silence. Work never ended. Men trudged to gather wood even when forest lay bare and branches snapped like glass in the cold. Women ground what little grain was left, their hands raw from turning the heavy stones. Children scattered straw across floors to cover damp earth, sweeping out filth with brooms of bundled twigs. Every task was small, yet each was a stitch in the fabric that held life together. Their huts smelled of smoke and animals, of damp straw and sweat, but they were not ashamed. That smell was survival itself, a perfume of endurance. Smoke clung to hair, to cloth, to skin, blackened rafters, and left the air hazy, but in that haze was warmth. Eyes stung, lungs ached, but bodies remained alive, and that was enough. The crackling of the fire was the music of life, each pop and hiss a reassurance that heat still flowed through the room. At night, the world outside seemed endless and merciless. Wind howled through trees like voices of the dead. Snow fell in heavy silence, and stars glittered cruelly above. Inside, peasants huddled close, bodies pressed together, in layered blankets, their breath mingling with smoke. Privacy was unknown, but comfort lay in closeness. Children slept wedged between parents, elders pressed to the edges, but wrapped in the warmth of younger bodies. Animals shifted in corners, their breath steaming, their weight anchoring the fragile hut against the void of cold beyond. Meals became rituals of gratitude. A pot of stew was stirred slowly, every bubble a promise that hunger would ease, if only for an hour. Bread was divided with care, portions measured by fairness more than fullness. Parents lied with gentle smiles, claiming their bellies were already satisfied, pressing scraps into the hands of children. Hunger carved hollows into faces, but it never conquered love. The act of giving, even when there was little to give, was a greater warmth than any fire. Faith bound them as tightly as straw bound their roofs. Prayers rose not only in churches but in smoky huts, whispered before meals, murmured before sleep, traced on doorways in chalk. Saints were invoked as guardians against cold, fever, famine. Holy water was sprinkled on hearthstones, candles burned in corners until their wax dripped like frozen tears. Promises were made in desperation. If only spring would come, if only this night would pass, if only the fire would last until dawn. Faith was not decoration, it was survival, a shield as necessary as wool cloaks or firewood. Elders told stories when the night grew too heavy. Their voices cracked but steady. They spoke of winters worse than this, of ancestors who endured with less, of miracles that came in the bleakest hours. Children listened wide-eyed, their fear softened by the rhythm of words. These tales were not only entertainment, they were weapons against despair. In every story was a reminder. We have survived before, and we will survive again. Outside, wolves prowled, their howls a reminder of hunger sharper than human. Sometimes footprints were found near the village, pressed into snow like warnings. Fear rippled through huts, but also resolve. Fires were stoked higher, doors barred tighter, spears kept close. The wolves were fierce, but peasants were fiercer, for their fight was not for prey but for existence itself. And through it all, the ember endured. Banked beneath ash, glowing faintly like a heartbeat, it was the centre of everything. Children were taught never to play too near, never to waste wood, always to protect the ember. For if it died, so too would hope. In the glow of that ember, families whispered prayers, shared meals, told stories, laughed even when hunger gnawed. It was more than fire. It was life distilled into light. Thus the peasants lived, Not as kings, not as warriors, but as quiet heroes of endurance. Their huts were fragile, their meals meagre, their clothes ragged, yet their will was unbreakable. Winter pressed with all its might, but still they rose each dawn, still they kindled flame each night, still they endured. Their legacy was not written in chronicles of war, but in the breath that turned to mist each morning, in the footsteps pressed into snow, in the laughter that rose defiantly against the cold. They were the unnamed backbone of history, carrying the world through winters that might have ended it. As the winter stretched on, each day blended into the next, indistinguishable from the last. But within this quiet monotony, life continued. Slow, deliberate, steady, like the beat of a heart too tired to stop but too stubborn to give up. Every morning brought the same struggle, waking to frozen breath, to frost on the windows, to the same steady rhythm of survival that had sustained them for years. There was no end in sight, only more of the same. Work, eat, pray, endure. It was the way of life, not just for the peasants, but for anyone who had ever lived in the harshest of conditions. The sun, when it appeared, was a weak and wan thing, offering no warmth, only light. Days were spent in shadow, the world outside covered in a blanket of snow and ice. It was a silent world, broken only by the occasional crunch of boots on the snow or the howl of wolves in the distance. Even the animals had learned to be still, their movements slow, deliberate, as if conserving every last ounce of energy. The wind was the loudest presence in the village, a constant companion, howling through the cracks in the walls, seeping under the door, turning the smallest gap into a door for the cold. Yet in the centre of each hut the fire burned bright, defying the dark cold, a flickering rebellion against the winter that refused to let go. In the cold, family became not just a source of warmth, but of strength. Children huddled with their parents, elders sat by the hearth, their hands working, their eyes never leaving the flames. Everyone had a part to play in the survival of the community. Men worked the fields, gathering what little could be salvaged from the earth. Women prepared the meals, tended to the children, and ensured that the fire never went out. The work was endless, each task a small victory against the cold, against hunger, against death itself. But these small victories were enough. They had to be. The animals too were part of this delicate dance of survival. The cows huddled close to the walls, the goats slept on straw, the chickens nested in whatever nook they could find. The warmth of their bodies was a small gift, a reminder that life could be sustained, even in the coldest of times. The animals did not complain. They did not ask for warmth or comfort. They simply gave what they had, their bodies a part of the human struggle to survive. And in return they were protected, fed, sheltered from the storm. Meals, when they came, were a reminder of how fragile life truly was. A pot of stew might be all there was to eat, and yet in that humble dish was everything. The peasants had learned to stretch their food, to make every morsel count, to take pride in the simplicity of what they had. The soup might be thin, the bread stale, the vegetables few, but it was enough. Enough to fill a stomach, enough to survive another day. And sometimes, when the fire burned brightest, when the wind howled loudest, a song would rise from the corners of the hut, a song of hope, of defiance, of life. The fire itself was a thing of great importance. It was more than just a source of warmth. It was the heart of the home. Without it, everything would crumble. Without it, there would be no light, no warmth, no food. The firekeeper, the one who tended to the hearth, was a guardian. They watched over the flame as if it were a child, adding wood, coaxing it back to life when it sputtered, ensuring it never went out. They understood that the survival of the family rested on their shoulders, that each flicker of the flame was a heartbeat, each crackle a breath. At night, when the wind outside moaned like a creature in pain, the peasants gathered close. There was no real sleep to be had, only a half-dream, a doze, a constant awareness of the cold creeping in, of the fire dimming, of the night stretching on like a dark river that could swallow them whole. But still, they slept, till they rested, for to rest was to gather strength for the next day, to prepare for another round in the endless war against the cold. They did not dream of warm beds, of soft quilts, of gentle nights. They dreamed only of surviving the dark, of keeping the ember alive. Sometimes, when the fire dimmed too low, when the wind howled too loudly, fear crept in. Fear that the warmth would fail, fear that the cold would win. But even then, there was something stronger than fear, a refusal to give up, a stubbornness that ran through the veins of every villager. Fear could not conquer them, hunger could not conquer them, the cold could not conquer them, they would not be defeated. And so the seasons passed. Slowly at first, but with inevitable certainty, the light began to shift. Days grew longer, sunlight began to creep in through the cracks in the hut. The fire no longer seemed so desperate, the cold no longer so oppressive. But even as spring began to approach, the peasants knew that they had survived the worst. They had faced down the longest nights, the deepest cold, and had emerged on the other side, still breathing, still standing. Their strength was in their endurance, their survival was in their will to keep going no matter what. The arrival of spring did not bring with it a grand celebration, for the peasants knew better. They had lived through too much to expect life to ever be easy. But it brought with it a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that you have endured, that you have survived, that you have made it through. The earth began to thaw, the animals grew stronger, and new shoots of green pushed through the ground. The fire no longer seemed so essential, but it was still tended to, still guarded, still cherished. The cycle of survival was never truly over. Spring came slowly, like a hesitant guest unsure of its welcome. The earth warmed inch by inch, but the memory of winter still clung to the bones of the peasants. Their clothes were still ragged, their bodies still weathered, but now the sun cast a more forgiving light, and with it came the first stirrings of life. The rivers began to thaw, their waters swollen with the remnants of ice, rushing in a steady chorus toward the sea. The fields, once frozen and barren, began to show signs of green, tiny sprouts, fragile and shy, pushing through the earth like the first breaths of hope. Yet even as the new season unfolded, the peasants knew that the cycle of survival never truly ended. They had fought against the cold, against hunger, against the very elements themselves, and now they would fight against time itself. They would plant, they would sow, and they would wait. The work never ceased. There were no breaks, no rewards, just the endless rhythm of survival. The fire, though now less urgent, still burned in the centre of each home. It was no longer a matter of life and death, but of comfort, of light, of warmth for the long evenings that stretched ahead. The hearth was no longer the only thing keeping the villagers alive, but it remained the heart of the home, where families gathered to share their meagre meals and stories of the long winter past. They spoke of those who had not survived, of neighbours who had perished in the cold, of the children who had succumbed to the sickness that came with the harsh months. But they spoke of these things quietly, without bitterness, for in their hearts they understood that death was simply a part of the cycle, as inevitable as the seasons themselves. For the peasants, survival was not just a matter of food or warmth, it was a matter of community, of the unspoken bond that tied them together in the face of hardship. They knew that they could not endure alone, that each person, no matter how small, played a part in the survival of the whole. It was this sense of togetherness that gave them strength, that allowed them to carry on even when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. The animals, too, became part of this delicate balance. As the days grew warmer, the livestock grew stronger, their coats shedding the thick winter fur that had kept them alive. The cows were milked, the goats tended, the chickens fed. But they were more than just animals. They were companions, they were part of the family. And in return for the warmth they provided, the peasants ensured that they were kept safe, that they were cared for. For in this world there was no room for cruelty. Survival was a mutual effort, a dance of give and take, where every action, no matter how small, had an impact. And then there were the crops, the earth itself. The peasants bent low to the ground, their hands in the soil, their backs aching with the labour of planting. They dug, they sowed, they prayed. Each seed they planted was a hope, each row of crops a prayer that the earth would yield its bounty, that the winds would not destroy what they had worked so hard to cultivate. It was not just about food, it was about survival, it was about the future, about ensuring that the next generation would have enough to eat, that they too could carry on the legacy of endurance. As the days grew longer, the air filled with the sounds of life, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, the laughter of children playing in the newly thawed fields. The peasants looked at each other, their faces lined with age and hardship, but their eyes filled with something more, a quiet pride. They had survived the winter, and now they would survive the spring. They would endure, because that was what they did. They had always endured, and they would continue to do so, no matter what. The fire continued to burn, a small, steady flame that would carry them through the nights ahead. It was not as fierce as it had been, but it was enough. The hearth still held the family together, still provided the warmth they needed to face the challenges of each day. The embers, though less bright, still glowed, and that glow was a reminder that survival was not just about the physical, it was about the spirit, about the will to continue, to keep moving forward. And as the season shifted once again, the peasants stood together, facing the future with the same quiet determination that had carried them through the darkest of winters. They did not know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain: they would survive. They would always survive, because they were bound by a strength greater than the cold, greater than hunger, greater than any storm. They were bound by each other, by the fire that burned in their hearts, by the shared will to endure, no matter what. As the warmth of spring began to stretch across the land, there was a subtle shift in the rhythm of life. The days grew longer, but so did the hours of work. The peasants, though grateful for the thawing earth, knew that the work was far from over. The soil had to be turned, the crops tended, the livestock cared for. Every step forward came at the price of labour, hard, unyielding labour, but it was a price they were willing to pay, for in their hearts they knew the value of what they were building. This wasn't just about survival. This was about creating something, about planting the seeds of hope that would grow into a future for their children. The air, once sharp and bitter with frost, now carried the sweet scent of fresh earth. There was no greater reward than the first sight of green pushing up from the soil, the first fragile tendrils of life breaking through the dirt. Each sprout, each blade of grass, was a promise that the worst of winter had passed, that the earth would continue to provide. And yet, as much as the peasants relied on the land, they knew they could never truly control it. They could tend it, care for it, hope for its bounty, but in the end, it was the land that would decide. It was a relationship built on respect, a recognition that survival was not a guarantee but a shared effort, a balance between the will of the people and the will of the earth. And so the peasants worked. They worked with their hands, with their bodies, and with their hearts. The ploughs scraped the earth. The seeds were scattered with the care of one who understands that life does not grow easily, that every crop is a small miracle. Children ran alongside their parents, learning the rhythms of planting, of watering, of tending. Their small hands, still soft, began to grasp the weight of responsibility. They were taught not just to work, but to appreciate the land, to listen to its rhythms, to feel the pull of the seasons in their bones. But even as the earth blossomed, the shadow of winter never truly left. The peasants knew that one harsh storm, one unforgiving frost could undo all their hard work. The winds could change, the temperatures could drop, and the fields that had once been green could turn back into the barren landscape of winter. They were never truly safe. They never truly relaxed. The seasons may have shifted, but the cycle of survival was unyielding, a constant reminder that the land, though generous, could also be cruel. Life in the village continued in this delicate balance between hope and caution. The fire that once burned fiercely in the heart of the home had become a quiet companion, no longer a lifeline, but still a necessity. It warmed the hands as they worked the land. It provided light during the long evenings when the work of the day was done, and it remained the centre of the village, the symbol of life that burned quietly but steadily. Even as the peasants worked the land and cared for their families, they always made sure the fire was tended, the coals were stoked, the flame was protected. The fire was not just for warmth, it was for everything. It was for the continuation of life itself. As the fields grew, so did the community. The harvest, though far off, loomed like a distant promise. The peasants spoke of it with a quiet confidence, as though their faith in the earth was enough to guarantee that the crops would thrive. They traded seeds, shared knowledge of the best ways to tend the soil, swapped stories of the last harvest and hopes for the next. Their lives were intertwined, their fates bound together by more than just survival, by the shared belief that together they could face anything. No matter how cold, no matter how hard, no matter how long the night, they would rise together, work together, endure together. And as the spring moved towards summer, there were moments of joy. The laughter of children rang through the village as they played in the fresh grass, the scent of flowers filled the air, and the days stretched out full of light. The work was hard, but it was good. It was life. And the peasants, though tired, though worn, though haunted by the memory of winters long past, found solace in the simple act of living. They knew that their survival was not just in the things they built, but in the community they created, in the bond they forged with each other, in the fire they tended so carefully. As summer approached, the village seemed to come alive with a different kind of energy. The earth, once cold and unyielding, had become a source of sustenance, and now the peasants could see the fruits of their labour taking root. The green fields were dotted with small crops, each one a promise of food for the months to come. The air was thick with the scent of growing things, cotton, squash, beans, and the wild herbs that had always been a part of village life. There was something about the summer that made everything feel more alive, more vibrant. The days grew long, stretching well into the evening, and for the first time in months, the peasants could feel a sense of ease, a lightness that had been absent during the harsh winter months. But even in the warmth of summer, the spectre of winter never truly left. The peasants knew the land could turn at any moment. The crops could fail, the weather could change, and the fish could once again find themselves battling the cold. They did not take their survival for granted. The lessons of the past were still fresh in their minds. The cycle of life was fragile, and it was not a given. For every grain that grew, for every tree that bore fruit, there was a hidden danger, a lurking threat that could take it all away. But this too was part of the life they had chosen. It was not about perfection, it was about persistence. It was about surviving, even when the odds seemed against them. The villagers spent their days working the land, their hands calloused from the work, their faces weathered from the sun. They dug trenches for irrigation, sowed seeds into the fertile earth, and tended to their animals with the same care and attention they had given to the fire during the winter. The animals, now stronger and healthier, provided milk, eggs and meat, and their presence was a reminder of the delicate balance between humans and nature. They were both workers and providers, each animal contributing to the survival of the community. In return, the peasants ensured that the animals were well fed, well cared for, and protected from any dangers that might arise. But the work was not without its struggles. The land, though generous, was unpredictable. One week the weather might be perfect, the rain falling just enough to nourish the crops. The next, a drought could settle in, turning the soil dry and brittle. The peasants fought against these challenges with all the ingenuity they had learned over the years. They built makeshift irrigation systems, they used every available resource to protect their crops, and they traded what little they had to ensure that the harvest would be enough. Their survival was never guaranteed, but their resolve was unshakable. They had endured the worst, and they would endure again, no matter the cost. The fires still burned at the heart of every home, though now they were more for cooking, for light, for comfort than for survival. The hearth was no longer the fierce, desperate flame that had kept them alive through the winter. It was now a steady, warm glow that brought people together in the evenings. The children, now older, would sit by the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, and listen as their parents told stories of the past, of the winters that had seemed endless, of the hunger they had endured, of the way the village had come together to survive. The stories were no longer just tales of hardship. They were stories of strength, of community, of the power of people working together. These stories were passed down from one generation to the next, a reminder that survival was not just about the individual, but about the collective effort of the community. As summer faded into fall, the harvest season arrived. It was a time of both celebration and anxiety. The crops that had been carefully tended for months were now ready to be gathered, but there was always a fear that they would not be enough. The peasants worked quickly, harvesting the grain, picking the vegetables, and preserving what they could for the cold months ahead. The air was thick with the scent of fresh produce, the sound of husks being cracked, and the quiet murmur of voices as neighbours helped each other gather the bounty. There was a sense of urgency in the work, but also a sense of camaraderie. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone worked together, knowing that the success of one was the success of all. The harvest was not just about food, it was about hope. It was a reminder that despite the challenges, despite the setbacks, they had managed to grow something from nothing. The peasants had planted the seeds, tended the crops, and now they were reaping the rewards. It was a victory, small but significant in the ongoing battle for survival. But even as they celebrated, they knew that the coming months would be hard. The cold would return, the days would shorten, and the warmth of summer would be a distant memory. The fire would once again become the centre of their lives, the hearth a symbol of endurance and strength. They would huddle together, sharing what little they had, telling stories to pass the long nights, and preparing for the winter that would come again. And in that preparation, there would be a quiet pride. For they knew that no matter how harsh the world outside might be, they had something no storm, no cold, no hardship could take from them, each other. As the leaves turned golden and fell, blanketing the earth in a soft, rustling carpet, the peasants prepared for the inevitable. The cold would come again, but they had learned over years of hardship to face it with strength and resilience. They had survived the winter before, and they would survive again. The harvest was in, and the village had food enough to carry them through the harsh months, but they did not let their guard down. Every winter was a test, and no matter how many they had survived, each one was a new battle. The fire remained their constant companion, a quiet, steadfast presence that flickered and crackled in the hearth, The warmth it offered a small but precious comfort against the ever-encroaching cold. The flames were a reminder of everything they had fought for. The warmth of family, the shelter of home, and the strength to carry on. As the nights grew longer and the days shorter, the peasants huddled closer together. The firelight danced on their faces as they shared stories and songs, their voices rising and falling in the warmth of the hearth. The children listened with wide eyes, absorbing the tales of the past, of winters gone by, of ancestors who had fought to survive, of the strength that ran through their blood. These stories were not just history, they were lessons, a way to pass on the knowledge and wisdom needed to face the future. The peasants had learned that survival was not just about food, not just about warmth. It was about community, about family, about never giving up. But even in the midst of their togetherness, the reality of winter loomed. The wind howled outside, its icy fingers creeping through the cracks in the walls. The cold seeped into the bones, a reminder that no matter how much they had endured, the elements would always be a force to reckon with. Yet the peasants had learned to adapt, to accept that survival was not about comfort, it was about perseverance. They had survived the worst of winters, and they knew they could survive this one too. The work would be harder, the nights longer, but they would face it as they always had, together. In the quiet, cold nights, the fire remained their beacon of hope, the one thing that could push back the darkness, the one thing that could remind them that no matter how harsh the world became, they were not alone. The warmth of the hearth was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was the warmth of shared experience, of resilience, of love. The fire burned not just for survival, but for everything that made life worth living. Family, community, and the strength to face whatever the world threw their way. And as the days passed, the peasants knew that the cycle would continue. They would plant again, harvest again, and face the cold again. They would survive, not because the world was kind, but because they were strong. The seasons would change, but the core of their existence would remain the same. They would endure, they would fight, and they would survive, because that was what they had always done, and what they would always do. As winter finally relented, the village had changed. No longer were their families huddled together by the crackling fire, enduring the long, cold nights. The sound of children laughing, once a distant memory from a time of hardship, was now a part of the everyday. One morning, when the sun gently broke through the clouds, the village seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The cold was gone, but the struggles of the past weren't forgotten. The villagers had planted the seeds, tended to the crops, and now they could see the fruits of their labour starting to emerge. The fields were no longer barren, but green with the promise of a bountiful harvest. The earth, once cold and unforgiving, now gave life. With every sprout and every blossom, there was a quiet pride that grew, as if nature itself was rewarding them for their resilience. The threat of the cold might not have been present, but the villagers knew too well that life was fragile, and so they continued to toil. Even in the warmth of summer, the memory of winter lingered in their hearts. They had fought hard for this moment, and they would continue to fight, to preserve what they had built. It was never about comfort, it was always about survival. The fire, once the centerpiece of their homes, no longer needed to burn as fiercely, yet it still flickered at the heart of every hearth, a steady reminder of what they had endured. The people who once feared the cold more than anything now feared nothing but the loss of what they had built together. They had learned that survival was not a solitary effort, it was a collective one. They learned that strength didn't come from muscle alone, but from the bonds they shared, the resilience they built in each other's company. They had survived because of each other, and they knew that in times of need, they would be there for one another again. The harvest was not just a time for gathering crops, but a time for reflection. Every grain gathered from the earth was a symbol of their endurance, a mark of their shared struggle. The villagers could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that they would survive another year. And yet, despite the easier days ahead, there would always be a part of them that remembered the harsh winters, the cold, the hunger, the endless struggle. Those memories would keep them grounded, keep them aware that survival was never guaranteed. As the seasons continued to turn, the villagers knew the cycle would repeat. The winters would come again, and they would face them with the same grit, the same determination. But no matter what the future held, they had learned something more valuable than anything the earth could offer them: the strength to endure. In their unity, in their resilience, they had built a future. It was not one of luxury or ease, but one of survival, of hope, and of unwavering courage. No storm, no cold, no hardship could take that away from them. The fire of survival, of community, of family, would continue to burn brightly, lighting their way through whatever darkness lay ahead.